Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar where we'll be talking about phonics. Now I use the general term phonics as do most teachers, teacher aides and parents when talking about the way in which or the program or activities that we use to teach kids, particularly younger kids, how to use sounds and how to develop reading and writing skills. Now, phonics is the broad term that we do use and it is most commonly used. There's a few other technical terms in there that I'll go through in a minute, but I wouldn't be too concerned with those. If you just use the word phonics, then I don't think that's a huge problem. Now, phonics basically refers to sounds, letters, and being able to use and manipulate them to make words. And I've got an example of some flashcards here which we'll go through later that are used for younger children. So let me find a really good example. This one here is for the letter G and it's got a picture of a goose and a goat. And on the back there's various different examples as well. And it says, the letter G has a hard sound before letters A, O, and U. So if you are involved with teaching phonics, and actually it says phonics on the top there, in any way, then I recommend buying a bunch of flashcards because they are an integral part of the phonics process. So there are several things. Actually, first, there are a couple of terms that I don't like to use too often, but I do fall into the habit of using a bit of jargon. Again, as long as you understand that phonics equals sounds or letters, then I think I would be quite happy with that. But if you are doing this as a part of a course or you're developing programs and diagnosing kids and things like that, then you probably need to know some of these more basic terms that you'll find quite regularly. Now, one of them is phonological awareness. That's an important term. And the difference between phonological awareness and phonemic awareness and phoneme, which is where phonics comes from. Okay, now the difference between these two in very, very simple terms is that phonological awareness, the very top one, is the bigger term that basically means working with different aspects of a particular language. So that includes sentences and bigger words, or actual just words. Whereas phonemic awareness comes from this word phoneme, and a phoneme means this, letters, sounds, those types of things, and that's where we get the word phonics, which I guess is the noun for the program and activities that we use to teach kids all about sounds and letters. So in summary of this little section, and I'll go through and talk about some of the, not the issues, but where phonemic awareness and phonological awareness kind of gel together and became almost the same thing, or we teach them at the same time. But the basic difference is think of that like sentences and whole words. Let's just write sentences. And phonemic awareness is more to do with individual sounds and letters. So just like in this phonics example we had here, it goes through, even just on the front there, CH for chair and chicken and so forth. So now this is why I think, well, one of the reasons for why I think understanding phonics and some of the basic concepts behind phonics that I'll go through in a minute, why it's really important is because it's a really good opportunity to help people to develop their literacy skills, even if you're teaching adults or you're teaching year 11s or 12s, because sometimes there are big gaps in people's knowledge and general understanding. And once upon a time, I used to teach year 11 and 12. I spent quite a lot of time working with kids who were students at educational risk, and they would be going out and doing work placements and things like that. to try and get them onto the right career path and out of gangs and drugs and things like that. And one of the issues we had with a lot of workplaces is they were, I suppose, less willing to provide feedback to us in written format. And quite often that's because they lack the confidence and potentially even the ability with some basic sentence structures and maybe even some phonics type issues as well. So particularly if English is a second language, we do a lot of phonics when teaching Indonesian, Japanese, French, and so on and so forth as well. So don't just think of phonics as something that we do in year 11, in year 1 and 2 or in pre-primary and so forth. It's something that is used throughout right up until year 11 and 12, to a lesser extent in those upper grades, and obviously we teach it in a very different way. But there's nothing wrong with revising the phonics and the sounds and the letters and revisiting those basics before, particularly if you get students in. I remember I had some ESL students in year 11 who could barely write their own name in English. So in those cases, and that was an English class, so for those students, going back to the basics, while it won't take them as long to learn it as in compared to year 1s and 2s, it is an important process to be aware of there. So I think at the university level, teachers don't learn how to do phonics. If they're high school teachers, I know I never did, and that was where my background is, in a high school teacher. I was lucky in a sense that I taught all grades, so I had to learn how to do phonics. I had to learn how to do lower primary and phys ed and teach second languages and things like that. But I also spent a lot of time teaching high school, obviously. So for me, I'm lucky I've been able to see that whole gamut from K to 12 and how this type of stuff is used all the way through. Okay, so there's just a couple of things I wanted to cover in terms of phonics and some, I guess, some rules of thumb about the best practices that we use when we are teaching phonics. So I'm just going to put some of those on the board. So the first one is that we do like to do it in small groups. So in a group work type interactive scenario, we like to do a lot of fun games. So again, fun, interactive type activities. We also like, so games, fun, group, yeah, games. I'll just do that as a separate one. And even though phonics is absolutely central to everything we do, because if students don't have a grounding, a good foundational understanding of phonics, so if they can't use all the different sounds, then they're really going to struggle later on. And I think that's quite obvious, because if you can't use the basic sounds that are found in a particular language, you're going to really struggle with reading those sounds inside a word, and then putting words together to make sentences. So, and that works in terms of creating those sentences and also interpreting or reading those sentences with any type of fluency. Because to read a sentence or a paragraph or a larger text or whatever it is with any level of fluency and understanding, if you get stuck on each individual word or too many words, then that particular student will lose concentration and they won't have the ability to string together all of the words to imagine or visualize or conceptualize what the sentence is trying to say, because they'll think of that word, then they'll spend a bit of time thinking of that word, and they'll miss the point of the whole sentence when all these different words are joined together. So it's important to have a certain level of fluency in order to understand, say, a sentence. Anyway, so we do a lot of group work, particularly small group work. When it comes to teaching phonics, we do a lot of fun, interactive type games, a lot of cards and those types of things. That's really important. It is a significant part of what we do. Whenever I write on the board, I always manage to spell things wrong. It's significant, but not everything. Yeah. So I could probably think of a better way to explain that. But by significant but not everything. So it is a very, very central and important part of, say, year 1 or kindy, pre-primary, but that doesn't mean we spend 100% of our time doing it. We do like to do a lot of other types of things as well, like pure exposure and what I like to call multimodal. That's not really associated with phonics and so forth, but I like to put that in there. And there's a lot of rote repetition. Okay, so by exposure, what that means is that students are being exposed to a whole raft of different words in different contexts, from different texts, from different people, from different types of people, from different genders and different age groups, and so on and so forth. So that exposure is one of the key aspects of anything to do with literacy. So there's actually another strategy here called Immersion. I'll just write another one up. Another couple while I'm here. And I'll just do one here. Okay, so that exposure is really important. With anything that we do in a literacy, reading, writing type sense, a lot of it is just pure practice. Now that practice can be in the form of rote or repetition, so the old look, cover, write, check. I won't do that there because it's not a part of that. Look, cover, write, check that's still used today. That's quite popular, where it's just you look at a word, you cover it up, you try and write it out. You look at a word, you cover it up, you then write that word out, and then you check to see if it's correct, and then you do it again. If you've got a list of 10 words, you start at the top, you cover it up, you go through and try and spell those words. When you get to one that's wrong, you have a look, and then you start again on the list. So that type of rote repetition, the old school traditional approach, not so traditional approach, but yeah, it's considered to be, I guess, the old school and a traditional way of doing things. We do a lot of the traditional type strategies in classrooms today, but because it's considered to be bad practice, what we tend to do is call it funky things like look, cover, write, check, but that's effectively a type of rote repetition learning anyway. So the other thing we do these days is that we try and limit it to a certain amount of time, and we also then use it in an immersion type way or with what is known as authentic texts. Sheesh, what is going on, Adam? Authentic texts. So now, authentic text is something more so associated with high school, but typically what that means is that the text that students are reading, so a text just means anything that has information on it in English language usually, they're reading something that's real, or they're writing something that's real, or they're listening or watching something or viewing something that's real and genuine. It's not made purely for educational purposes. Now, in a primary school setting, authentic text means that, particularly in early childhood, we're not just doing worksheets, we're actually reading real books and things like that, picture books even. Well, not so much picture books, but a predominantly picture book that has some words and sentences and things on it, then that's okay because it's also engaging and fun and interactive. And again, a lot of those books too just come from a rote repetition type perspective. So they're just practicing these activities over and over again, practicing using those words in various different contexts and in various different modes, so they might see it on TV and so forth. And by authentic, that also means that they're using the type of words in class and learning the words that they're likely to come across outside of class. So when they're interacting with their friends or their parents or watching TV or they're on a computer or whatever. So that is the best way, considered to be best practice anyway, that is the best way. Well, it's not the best way, but it's one of the strategies and one of the methods that you would use to try and develop programs and resources. So you're just bearing that in mind. That doesn't mean you can't use resources that are developed specifically for the teaching and learning process, but just remember that term there, authentic text, because it is quite an important term. Now, the reason I wrote that on there is because what reminded me of that was there's this concept of immersion. Now, immersion is used in English as a second language classrooms a lot, but it applies across the board. And what that basically is exposure. But it's constant exposure. So if you've ever learned a second language, you'd know that it's very, very difficult unless you're in the country where that language is spoken as a first language or as a national language or whatever. So it's very hard to learn Japanese unless you actually go to Japan and live there and you're constantly speaking it. So you're engaged or you're immersed around people all day. You live, breathe, eat, sleep. You're in with people who speak Japanese. If you're living in Japan and you're constantly living with people or interacting with people who speak English, then your language skills won't grow that fast. But if you're completely and utterly immersed in that language, then it only takes a few months before you start to approach the level of being fluent. So the same applies, the same sort of concept applies when we're teaching kids, particularly when we're teaching second languages. You put them in a classroom that's completely surrounded by images and pictures and signs and things like that that try and simulate, I guess, that immersion type experience. And you try and speak that language as much as possible in class. So you're speaking less and less English and more Japanese or Indonesian or whatever it is. So that's what immersion is. Now that applies also to any type of learning. So if you're constantly surrounded by sounds and letters and so on and so forth, then obviously that's going to help as well. As a part of that, there is a lot of explicit instruction. Right, I mean, explicit instruction is obviously, watch my video on explicit instruction. It's obviously very different when we're dealing with really young kids compared to if we're dealing with, say, year 9s or year 10s. But explicit instruction combined with, wish I knew what the mathematical symbol for that is. I'm trying to think. No, I don't. So I'm just going to have to write combined. Combined with some, I guess you could call it practice, right? So practice, that would be an S. No, that would be a C. I always get those two confused. Okay, so explicit instruction combined with actual practice. And that basically means that the teacher or teacher aide is using flashcards, for example, or whatever it is to explain to students, this is a particular sound. This sound is used here. Da, 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 da. And that'll make a bit more sense when we go through the next section as well about where that explicit instruction is more commonly used when we're trying to develop students' phonological awareness and the different aspects of that. So we've gone through exposure and that idea that exposure/immersion, the more just the volume, the sheer volume of being exposed to different sounds and words and so forth. That reminds me of another one, whole word and sight words. And we've gone through rote and repetition because obviously that's kind of related. Exposure, multimodal, rote, repetition and immersion, like they're all kind of the same thing. The next one I've written down there is not to rush. Now what I mean by not to rush is that you don't want to be teaching phonics when you get to year 9 or something. I mean obviously there's a period of time where it really becomes a focus, and particularly as we move from phonics to get to the sort of whole word type level where we're getting kids to see an actual word, a sight word as we call it, particularly for those high utility words, those top 200 or 300 words that are used all the time. They see that word, they recognise it sort of as an object and are able to describe it straight away, or they're able to say that sound straight away or say that actual word straight away without having to sound it out. But we do want them to get through the process, and we do want them to get to that other end as soon as possible so that we're still not teaching them sounds and letters and things like that later on, because obviously, yeah, they need to move on. But at the same time, don't be afraid to do reviews. And they're what I like to call them reviews. And how I explain that is because your basic lesson plan, let's say that's your lesson plan on a piece of paper, whether it's a lesson plan or an activity or whatever, you always have reviews at each end, whether you're teaching super modern, sort of constructivist type play-based learning or whatever. It's always good to have some type of summary at each end, even if whether it is that more trendy type of, hippie type strategies, or whether it's more old school traditional explicit instruction or direct instruction or whatever. I still always like to put some type of review, even if it's for 20 seconds. You're always doing reminders and consolidation and so forth. Now, this is important because here you're linking to previous knowledge, so you're linking to what they did the week before, or the month before or the day before or whatever. You're doing some diagnostic and / formative type tests there, not so much diagnostic, but you're trying to figure out what students are good at, what they aren't good at, where you need to maybe direct some of your targeted attention and time for that particular lesson. You're also thinking about if they're at a certain spot and they're ready to move on to the next level of difficulty or the next level of challenge as far as the phonological side of things goes, and we'll go through that in a second. So you're doing a lot of formative assessment there, and you're reminding students where they're at and what they've done in the past, and helping them take it from long-term sort of confused memory to the short-term current working memory, so that they can then access that information and use it here. I've done a video on spaced learning, which I would highly recommend watching, because that goes through and shows why those constant reviews are really important, and how physiologically constant or those regular reviews help the brain, physically help the brain grow those neurons and synapses and shortcuts and things like that, so that that information is put into long-term memory, is consolidated, and our ability to pull that information to short-term memory to automatically recall and use it becomes stronger. So physically those connections become stronger the more often we're required to retrieve it into working memory or into short-term memory and to be able to use it. So that's why review activities are really good. Again, you've got that formative assessment there, and it helps students fill in gaps, because they may understand 8 out of 10 things, and those reviews just help fill in those little gaps as they go. It just makes more sense. Okay, so I'll just rub that one off anyway. So we've gone through, when I say don't rush, I mean that it's important to make sure that you really consolidate and get these foundational things right first. So if the foundation of the pyramid, for some reason in education we use pyramids, or there's a lot of models out there that use pyramids, right? So if down the bottom here, if you've got your, let's just say letters and letters, so you need to understand the basics of the letters before you can come up here and understand the words and individual words. And you need to know that before you can come up here and understand sentences of sorts, right? So don't copy that. I just invented that on the spot. It's probably not the... I think if I spend a bit of time, I might come up with a slightly different model. But the point is, what I'm trying to explain is that it's got to get that foundation right first. Now, that doesn't mean that in that triangle we can't move between doing individual letters and sounds and things to the whole word and start teaching whole words, because kids will learn whole words and sight words at the same time as they are learning phonemes, so sounds. These phonemes, it's sort of a combination, and we'll go through a procedure, sort of a universal procedure in a minute for the steps that students go through when they are acquiring that phonological awareness, moving from not really knowing much to be able to write full sentences and things. But as we go through that, and one thing that I'll explain is that it's not really a stepped process. It's taught like that, but that's incorrect, and it's simplistic. And like everything in education, it's just used as a guide. And in actual fact, what happens is students already know a lot of words. They come to school, they can already speak, 600 words or something like that, 300 words, whatever it is. And because they already have that background, they already have some knowledge of, they've already started to develop their accent and so on and so forth. So it's not like they're coming in and starting at zero with no word knowledge whatsoever, or no phonological or phonemic knowledge at all. They're coming in with a significant amount of information. They've already had tons of exposure in a multimodal fashion, and that's because of, by and large, because of immersion. So they're constantly immersed in that environment where parents and siblings and that kind of thing will be talking to kids constantly before they go to school, and it's probably thousands and thousands of words a day. So they do get lots of repetition. Okay, so in fact, that's probably a good time to go through. The only other thing I didn't explain here is number sense while I'm rubbing all this off. Now, number sense, and the importance of number sense is that it's kind of a little I guess, a little known program, I guess you could call it. And I consider number sense to be the equivalent of phonics. It's generally the equivalent. So all of these things that we're learning about best practice when we're going through and teaching phonics is the same, or pretty much, I'd say pretty much the same thing happens when we're teaching number sense. Now, number sense is just about helping kids understand how to use, and I like to say, play with numbers. So they know what 1 means. They can see just a simple number, say 3, and they know what that means. So they're developing that confidence to be able to play around and use numbers. Yeah, so just bear that in mind, that these apply to maths as well. In other words, well, not to maths, but to numbers as well. Okay, so there is a few steps that is generally universally accepted. Some people call it a spectrum or a hierarchy or whatever, it doesn't really matter. There's a few steps that students go through that help us. I just thought of another one, sorry. And I'll come back to that. There is a few steps that students go through that as teachers or teacher aides or literacy specialists or even those teaching in the adult sector, that students go through as they're developing more competence and skills when it comes to phonics and phonological awareness. So remember that phonological awareness is the wider sort of term, and phonics is that smaller sort of term when we're talking about just individual sounds and letters. But don't be too concerned about, don't be too concerned about that. Sometimes I just use them interchangeably. It doesn't, who really cares, right? So, okay, now the first one that I always put up, although I like to, I guess this is just my model, I like to say that exposure is the number 1 step. So that happens before they come to school most of the time. But again, with all of these steps, it happens throughout our career. Now, I'm still learning how to spell different words. I'm still learning different strategies to spell words. Every now and then I hear a word and I think, well, that's an interesting word, or I'm Googling a word on my phone or whatever. So even as adults, we're still exposed to new learning. But what I basically mean by exposure is that kids are at home and they're just constantly immersed and around that language. So they're not coming to school with 0. And that's really important because as a parent or grandparent or carer or whoever, one of the best things that you can do before they hit school is to just give them as much exposure as possible to a wide range of age-appropriate words, and some that are just outside their ability, sounds, different types of people pronouncing words. We do know that males pronounce words very differently to females, and that male and female use their purposefully and learn to use their vocal cords in different ways. So being able to being exposed to different types of people, older people, younger people, different accents, is an important part of that process of going through and mastering the English language. So the first thing that really happens is phonics. The first thing that happens is exposure. The second thing that really happens is phonics. So, right, and I'm going to call that, I guess, explicit. Now, what I'm basically meaning by phonics is that the teacher or the teacher aide or whoever is working with the student, quite often it'll be in an early childhood setting before school as well, is that there will be some type of explicit attempt to teach phonics. Now that can be, for example, using picture cards or whatever other games or activities. Quite often there's a lot of tactile and kinesthetic type work where students have blocks or different ways of representing letters and sounds, and they move them around and that kind of thing. And what we're really trying to do here is get children to be comfortable and familiar and confident. So at this point, they're not looking to ace phonics. We don't need to teach them every single sound, every single letter combination, all this type of stuff. We just want them to be comfortable, familiar, and confident with being able to manipulate sounds. They're just used to having them around, even though they're not experts at them. It's just normal. So let's go with normal. I like the word normal. It's normalized is another way to think of it. And that sort of comes from that exposure part as well. So I might sort of join that together. So with explicit, what that means is that we're also not just having it around constantly, but we're also teaching it in a way where we're sitting down and explaining that this letter here is a C. Now, where have you seen the letter C before? Do you know any other similar letters? Oh, what words have the word C in it? And so on and so forth. So that's what I mean by explicit instruction. Explicit means the teacher is, or teacher aide or whoever is actually teaching phonics in some way. That's what that's what explicit basically means. You've got that general exposure. Actually, this stuff here should be sort of for both really, but you've got that general exposure and then you've got phonics there. Now, as number 3 is called deletion. Onset and Rhyme. Sorry, I'm just going to write them all up to make it a little bit easier. I'm nearly done. And run out of room. That's not it. Okay, so cool. Now the reason I've done this in a different colour is because I always add these to the top of this sort of spectrum. Some people call it a spectrum, some a hierarchy, whatever. And the idea is that students start up here and they come down here. And this is sort of, I guess it's not difficulty, but if you're diagnosing what levels kids are at, or you're looking at what they can and can't do, if they can't do this bit here, if they don't know the basics of the phonics, so they don't know the basic phonemes, so they don't know the sounds like, you know, the ch and so on and so forth, then they're really going to struggle to do the next bit. In fact, they're not going to be able to do the next bit. That doesn't mean they have to ace this section before they can move on, but it does mean that they, I don't know if I was to put a number on it, they'd have to be, well, they wouldn't need to know every single sound combination, which, by the way, there's a special name for sound combinations. So if there are 2 of them, if there are 3 of them, and it's just escaped me, I can't even remember that word now. One of them's called digraph, that's it. Yeesh. And a trigraph. That was going to be embarrassing. So if there are 2 letters that go together, like the CH, I don't know if you can see that, that's called a digraph. If there are 3 of them that go together, like tri, that's called a trigraph. So that's just a thing to the side. And again, there's lots of terminology in this sort of world. Just ignore it, don't worry about it. You'll come across lots of programs that try and make it sound like you need to buy this really expensive program or this special book because it's some type of magic pill that'll mean your children or your class or whatever are going to be the best in the world. But most of it, well, all of it is just sort of rubbish, because realistically, all students go through a very similar process. Every student goes through a similar process, the same process and the same steps when they're learning when they're learning phonics and they're learning that, developing that phonological awareness through their schooling years. It always starts with exposure and it always moves on to some type of explicit instruction. So again, and the other thing I'll always point out, and I say this in a lot of my lectures, watch my one-on-one instructional video, because I go through diagnosis and why diagnosis is really important and simple. Instead of spending money on these super expensive programs, you can very easily figure out specifically where is that child having problems. If they're having issues with reading or writing or whatever, you can narrow it down. And you can also very easily try and diagnose if they're having problems with sounds or particular letters or whatnot. So you can easily test that. Now, A lot of people think that they do need to go and buy expensive commercial products, but if you're very clear on what you're trying to test, so if you're saying, well, there's 26 letters in the English alphabet, I want to test to make sure that they know all 26. So you just develop a quick little test for that. That could be an oral interview, it can be flashcards, it can be just standing at the front of the class or in front of a small group saying, write this letter down, A, B, whatever. So you can easily develop these little tests that go through and try to accurately diagnose where students are. So you can provide a diagnosis because you need an accurate diagnosis in order to be able to provide a treatment. And you cannot provide, like a health practitioner or whatnot, an accurate treatment if you don't have an accurate diagnosis. So to say a student is bad at phonics is a falsehood. That means you're not doing a very good job. There is no such thing as being bad at phonics. There are simply specific things within that area that student is not familiar with. And they might not be familiar with it because they just don't have the knowledge. They might have a disability or whatnot, or a learning disorder. They might have something physically wrong with them, like a jaw issue that hasn't been diagnosed yet. They may just have been away for a while. There may be certain things that are difficult to pronounce because of their first language, and so on and so forth. So they may just lack exposure or lack that repetition. So sometimes just a bit of repetition can help. And of course you can do that in fun ways, like in games and sing-alongs and various different things. But anyway, that's by the by. So these two things, I add those on, so that's my own little contribution to the world, I guess. But generally it starts here. So when students are starting to learn phonics and they're starting to get to the point where they can manipulate words and things, this is where the first thing that they say, experts say, or whatever, the model says that students are able to do, and that's deletion. So deletion basically means that a student can look at a word. Let's say they've got a three-letter word. Let's say they've got a three-letter word there. I won't even write anything in there to make it even more obvious. They've got a three-letter word there. You want them to just delete that first one, that first letter there. Very, very simple, but at certain ages, not so simple. So all you're getting them to do is to delete that word to see what's remaining, or to swap that word out with, swap that letter out, with another word. So that's all deletion basically means. Now I like to think that, so this area here is where they're just purely just taking it all in. They're just being exposed. And they're learning, there's lots of repetition and stuff there, and they're learning, but it's not so much explicit. This is the bit where it becomes a bit more explicit, and this is the bit where they start mucking around, not so much with just individual sounds, but where they're starting to use actual words, so and to play with words. So this is the crux of it. And I like to say that this is the critical stage. I'd probably say that. Maybe you could include 4 or 5 if you want, but I reckon this is the most important bit. If we say that you need the most important part of your education, particularly in the young years, is learning phonics and developing that foundation so you can go on and do bigger and better things. This is probably the section which is the most important part of that model. Now, so deletion, very simple. It just means you can swap things in and out, swap words and letters, swap letters and sounds as well in and out. So your digraphs and trigraphs, so it's not just individual letters. And again, what students are doing here is just playing with sounds and letters. They're so they're manipulating, and they're able to just have an understanding for how you can move letters in and out and replace them and what effect that has and so forth. Obviously, there's various different levels involved there. You're not going to give them words like miscellaneous or something like that. So basic words, and they're starting to get an idea, 2, 3, maybe 4-letter words type of thing. They're starting to get an idea of how sounds interact with each other. Very basic. Now, onset and rhyme. If you have a word such as I'm going to do a really huge, big, difficult word here, cat. So with the word cat, onset and rhyme, once they have a fair idea about deletion and they can muck around and play around with that. So if you're diagnosing any student and you're like, well, they got a good idea of phonics, they understand all the sounds that they need to know. That doesn't mean they understand every single sound, but they understand all the sounds, all the phonemes that they need to know. So the next thing we'll test for and see where they're at as far as if they're at this third sort of stage, which is deletion. So can they swap things in and out? And the next level is what is called onset and rhyme. Now, onset basically is this bit here. So it's just the first letter in a particular word, or the first sound in a particular word. And rhyme, and yes, that is spelt R-I-M-E, not R-H-Y-M-E. Rhyme, R-I-M-E, means the second or follow-up sounds. So you've got, in this case, the rhyme is at. So students at this level, they're getting a feel for individual letters and sounds at very simple, basic ideas at a very basic level. And onset and rhyme, mainly usually this is the first one. But deletion and onset, again, are these are all related. So you can see how there's a logical flow from one to the next. Now, obviously we can swap that for dog. Maybe I don't know why I said that. Okay. So if we've got cat, obviously we can swap that for a bunch of other words very simply, dog not being one of them, like mat, for example. Or we can say sat. Let's go with sat. So that's what onset and rhyme is. Very closely related to deletion, but you can see, unlike phonics here, they're starting to play around with the very basics of small, simple and relevant words. And by the way, just as a little side note, I think students, there's a thing called high utility words or high use words. There's a few other, not acronyms, there's a few other terms that mean that same thing. But I like to, early on in the phonics, not even early on, but at some point, is to either do a diagnosis test of some description, but to bear in mind and think about the top 200, the top 300, and particularly the top 500 words, that comes a little bit later on, to make sure that students are aware of and can spell and use and understand those top 500 or so words, because those, I can't remember of the statistics on it, but it's something like the top 500 words are used, I don't know, somewhere in the vicinity of 9 out of every 10 words in a sentence includes those top 500 words. So if you're teaching, say, year 3 or 4 or even year 2 or whatever, starting to use those high utility words is really important. You're already going to be doing that as you're teaching phonics because, you know, sit or sat and these types of things are high utility words. Anyway, actually, I'm not 100% sure if sit and sat is a high utility. I assume it would be. But anyway, if you just Google high utility words, you'll find plenty of information about that and lists and things like that. Also, in high school, sort of that upper primary, early high school level, there are various different spelling tests available that test students' ability at different levels. So there's one called the South Australian, I think it's just called the South Australian Spelling Test. That's the one that's commonly used across Australia. There's probably new ones now. There's always lots of different types out there. And what that basically did is take words that are at various different levels. So let's say you've got, in the English language, you've got the 200 easiest words and then another couple of hundred, another couple of hundred. It took a selection of words from each of those and put them into a test that then students could do, gave you instructions on how to read it out. So I used to do this with year 9s. You'd go through, you'd test them, it would give you an accurate diagnosis about their score and you would know they were at level 3 or level 4 or whatever. I can't remember specifically what the marking criteria was, but it gave you an idea of the standard. So this is just a standard of, I guess, a spectrum of skills. So students go through the different stages and the same applies for, I guess, spelling and things like that. There are, as with all of these skills, you can divide it up into different levels. And by the way, if you've ever been involved in any reading programs, you'll know that most reading programs, they call them various different things, but you have different levels or stages, right? So level 1, level 2, level 3. Now, all that means is that level 1 uses certain high utility words, level 2 uses some from the next sort of category, and so on and so forth. So you can design that out. You know, if you ever wanted to develop your own reading program or something, that's basically how it works. And then in here, you'd put various different types of grammatical features as well. So you might just put full stops in the first one. The second one, you might add in a few commas and an exclamation mark or something, and so on and so forth. So you're doing slightly different and more advanced things and building on those previous levels as you go through. And when it does come to those, say you're in, I don't know, year 6 class and your students are doing, year 5 class even, and your students are doing reading for 15 minutes after lunch every day, you'll have a selection of books available. And you can classify those books into different levels, 5 different levels, 10 different levels. You can usually also buy, there's quite a lot of programs out there where this is already done for you, and they seem to be quite effective. And then students can go, there's 20 books at level 1, 20 books at level 10, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. So anyway, that is just a little side note there. So that's onset and rhyme. Now syllables. Syllables are pretty simple and pretty easy. So let's erase some of this. Yes, I'm going to have to erase some of this because I'm just never going to have enough room, sorry. Okay, so with the whole, I just thought of another one I put here. I just want to put grammar. Because I'll come back to that one. Now, with the whole syllable thing, say the word table, obviously that has 2 syllables. Now, there are different types of syllables. There's quite a few different types of syllables actually, and personally, even as an English teacher, I always found syllables to be a little bit confusing, because if you showed, say, 3 or 4 adults, even professionals who have master's degrees or whatever, a bunch of words, they're actually going to divide those words in a different way. If you said, oh, how many syllables in this? You might end up in a bit of an argument, because the whole syllable thing can actually be quite confusing. So if you're a little bit worried when I start talking about syllables, well, you're not on your own there. So, but with basic words, usually it's pretty easy to divide up things into by syllables. Syllables, by the way, an easy way to think about syllables is not sounds. Quite often you hear people say, a syllable is an individual sound. It's not. It's usually an individual vowel. So vowels are like, here's a different colour. So vowels are like T's, and it normally follows, sorry, did I say vowels? Normally it's a consonant followed by a vowel or some type of, normally it's a consonant followed by a vowel. So you've got T there. You generally know that if there's a T, that's going to be the start of a syllable. So you've got T, and then it follows with that vowel, and then the next syllable, has a consonant that is the B, and it follows with the L and the E. So bleh, table, table. So I tend to think of syllables, and this is how I teach it as well. Although I try not to go too deep down the rabbit hole as far as grammar is concerned. I try not to use too much, even when I'm teaching adults and teaching this stuff to professional teachers and things, we try not to talk about we don't use more terminology and jargon than we have to. So in some lectures we have to. When I was doing the writing skills lecture, I didn't really go any further than just saying the word phonics, because for that particular lecture that was far enough. And the same with kids. We don't want to use, so for example, you've got hard vowels and soft vowels and so on and so forth. So we don't really need to go down that road. Even if you talk to a lot of adults these days and ask them what an adjective is or what a proper pronoun is and stuff, people quite often struggle. So when you are teaching these types of things, we try to use authentic text so that sentences are already there, and picking apart that from a grammatical point of view can be an interesting way of doing it, and certainly you can offer some of that information, but just make sure that you're not assessing students as we did in sort of the 40s, where they need to know what a subject-verb sentence is or whatever. So because it's really just not the way we do things anymore, and it's not that relevant to being able to develop these skills anyway, because bear in mind what our goal is down here. Our goal is down here not for students to have a in-depth knowledge of grammar structures and sort of the ontological structures and lexicography type structures that come with the English language, but to understand and be able to use words. That's what we're really trying to achieve. As a side note though, it is quite easy to learn some basic grammatical structures that you can teach to students as you go on, and you can demonstrate it on the board. It can become part of a quiz and things. So, and this is just a bit of a party trick too, because a lot of people don't know this. And that's where, or is that grammatically correct or incorrect? There should be an apostrophe there somewhere, right? So assuming that was a sentence or in a sentence, so don't worry about the start and the end. Whereabouts around that S would I put an apostrophe? Sorry, not an apostrophe. Yeah, an apostrophe. Whereabouts would I put the apostrophe? I got confused there with exclamation. Where would I put the apostrophe? It's a bit of a trick question because you can put it in multiple locations, right? Or can I? Yes, you can. So you can put it there. Now, what does that mean compared to if I was to use it there? What's the difference? Well, the difference is that because it goes on this side of the S, that there is a single dog. So that bone is owned by one dog. So it's singular. Now, if I was to move that, obviously there to that side, now what does that mean? That means that that bone is owned by multiple dogs. So there, in this case, the dog's bone would be indicating that there are two dogs over there that are sharing a bone, type of thing. Now, that seems pretty obvious, right? But I guess it depends how you explain it. So many people get confused by that. And I even see, I think I saw this on TV the other day, breaking news, and then it has the wrong apostrophe sort of thing there. There are some exceptions to that while we're on the topic, like, no. Yeah, let's do that one. Women's store or women's clothing or whatever. Because women is already plural, plural means two, the opposite of plural is singular, right? So because women, that word already means two or more women, we don't need to indicate here that there are multiple women because the word already does it for us, right? Bearing in mind the purpose we use grammar and these types of things, this type of punctuation is to help with understanding. And if you're ever confused or you're not sure what to do, especially when there are multiple options available, just remember, how can I most simply provide this information to the person who reads this in a way that makes sense to them? That's the whole purpose of grammar, is to provide information to other people in a way that makes sense and as it was intended. If you intended to say that there was 10 dogs over there, then you need to make sure you write that and write it in a way that makes sense. Okay, cool. Anyway, so point of that is that you can teach those little things if you want to teach those little things. Another one, by the way, is, did you know that there are 3 types of hyphens? There's a little one. The main two, there's a little one and there's a bigger one. That's called an N. I don't even know how to pronounce that actually. And that's called an M. So that one's a hyphen that joins words together, like best practice, research based. So that little hyphen in the middle. Yeah, and the M is more of a dash that you put between lines, between sort of sentences when you want to join 2 sentences together. So you don't want to use a full stop, but you want to join 2 sentences together. And I'm not going to do an example of that, but you can look that up anyway. So I wouldn't be too concerned about teaching students that, but there are plenty of students in a class, if you're teaching upper primary or whatever, who just love learning about that type of stuff, and it's actually quite simple. Usually it's quite simple if you can explain it in a relatively simple way. And very few people, I know with the apostrophe thing, very few people get that right. But anyway, okay, so there's your syllables, dividing things down. So teaching kids how to divide things down into syllables and how to combine syllables and how to muck around with syllables. And I'm just trying to see, I don't think this has syllables in it. It's actually got card games, so this has actually got some activities for how you can use these cards in lots of different ways. No, it doesn't have syllables in here. So this is only sort of up at this level, and it hasn't quite gone down here. But there's lots of different games you can get that do that do help you with syllables and things as well. Cool. Next one is segment. Syllable, by the way, is a type of segment. So segment is, if you don't know what the word segment means, actually segmentation is the actual correct word there. I might as well write the correct. Segmentation. Now what that basically means is that you're chopping something up, dividing it into segments, or dividing it into little different categories or piles. So when you do the word table and you divide that into 2 syllables, you're actually segmenting it. So that's also a type of segmentation, but I don't like to use that there because it confuses people. Now, segmentation here, what that refers to is where you're dividing sentences up into different words and playing around with it. So the cat sat on the dog. Okay, so if you've got a simple sentence like the cat sat on the dog, now segmentation, if students are up to this stage, then they're starting to move these around and being able to play with them. So how would we show that so that the dog sat on the cat, for example? So obviously they would be, okay, so you've got a cat there, you've got a dog there, and they might be learning about these things, doing words, and they might be learning about these types of words, on, at, below, so on and so forth. So in that sense, they're able to manipulate, just like they were with phonics. They can move words around, letters around, sounds around, play with different sounds and see what the effect is and so forth. So that segmentation stage is really about being able to do that. Now, this is the point at which students need to have developed something of some level of skill when it comes to sight words. So you want them to be able to go, the cat sat on the mat. Because remember what I was saying at the start, that if they can't do that, then they won't be able to make meaning of that whole sentence. Because if they get stuck here for 10 minutes trying to figure out what that word is, then they move on to this one and then they get stuck there. By the time they get down to dog, they're not going to remember that word there and the whole thing won't make sense because they're looking at each of those in isolation as opposed to going through with some level of, automation to be able to go, the cat sat on the dog. So they need to be able to do it with a level of fluency and at a certain speed because these words will jump into their short-term memory, to their working memory. But if they don't get to hear quick enough, it'll fall out of their short-term memory and then all they'll see is the dog. So that's why, and one of the reasons why kids can read things and then not really understand what's going on because they've forgotten what's happened at the start. So you want them to be able to get through with a decent amount of speed, and that's where sight words are important. And you can see why sight words has gone beyond phonics. So instead of just knowing sounds like k and at or whatever, or even just the individual letters, so you've gone from the individual letters to the sounds to whole words to then being able to put it into sentences and to be able to move sentences around and things like that. Okay, so you can see that sort of natural progression going on there. And as I said, with all my strategies that I talk about and all the videos, that I make about strategies and different ways of teaching things, you don't have to do it in this exact order. These are just suggestions. If you look online, these are pretty much, there's a few different versions. I add some in there. There's a lot that goes underneath it as well. So there are a lot of, after comparison, there's a lot of other ones right up to critical literacy is where I would consider the last one to be. So I'm just going to draw that on there. I call it text creation and then critical literacy. Now, I'll go through that later. But point is, if you're here, that doesn't mean you can't revisit that. You should be doing revisions quite regularly. And I can't remember if I did I did that little lesson plan earlier because we have reviews. So reviews/revision, lesson plan we're going to do, or activity, and we're going to do some reviews on the either end, on the book end of our activities, which always feeds back to the basics, because if students aren't understanding those basics and constantly having them reconsolidated in their brain, then you're going to struggle down here. And just because they knew how to do that 3 weeks ago does not mean they know how to do it today. And they can always get better at it, particularly if you're trying to build that repetition and perfect certain sounds. So that's what syllables is. That's what segmentation is. Alliteration is quite simple. I always think Coca-Cola when I think of alliteration. Alliteration is a poetic type technique that basically means the first letter of a word is the same. So Coca-Cola is one, Peter, Pan. So you've got those two letters there are the same. That's all alliteration means. Very, very simple. And rhyme. Now, the idea with alliteration is that the other thing with alliteration, is that it does give you you can see where there's heaps of opportunities with alliteration to be able to do songs and sing-alongs and to be able to get lots of rote and repetition practice in by using games. So, and it also just gets students just practicing those sentence structures. So they're used to speaking and seeing those words in certain orders, like the. So we were talking about before the dog. So they just get used to doing that. So it just becomes automated. And then if you look at that where it was the dog sat on the cat or the other way around, we had it. But if they don't need to concentrate on that because it's just automated, then the only thing they need to think about is that, sat, dog, sat, cat. And they can ignore the other little words in there and then there's significant less mental stress and power required. You've reduced what is called their cognitive load. So if you can reduce their cognitive load, then they can get through that sentence with a much more fluency and have a much higher understanding and be able to join that sentence together with another sentence as well and see the relationship between the two and be able to build up and visualize a bigger picture in their head a lot more easily. So that's called cognitive load. Have a look at that. Cognitive load is generally not thought of to apply to phonics, and in fact, I don't think anyone ever talks about cognitive load in that sense, but I think it's very relevant to not just teaching adults and things, but to also teaching kids as well, particularly with those type of issues that we've spoken about before, where you're trying to develop that level of fluency. So rhyme is very simple. Rhyme is where you've just got words that literally rhyme with each other. So there's alliteration and rhyme. You can see that how they are kind of related. They're not the same thing, but I would consider them not the same thing, but I would probably put them in the same category as terms of level of difficulty. So now you're going on and you're talking about the different functions of language and practicing how you see them and how they sound. And you can talk about the different ways in which that can happen. So if you've got purple, let's go Peter's purple pumpkin. Now, the one thing that I'd like to point out with that's obvious to me, there's two things, but I'm going to do one to begin with, is P-E, P-U, P-U. So even though they all start with P, they all have a slightly different sound. So pe for Peter's, per for purple, pa for pumpkin. Now, this is where it starts to get tricky for kids because, and why this is the next step above segmentation, that I've drawn it below, is because, and one of the reasons is, these two sounds here, they are the same sound on paper, but they're actually different, right? So per and pa, so they're just slightly different. Can you feel that there's a slight difference there? There's probably a lot of better examples that you can think of if you were to specifically be developing something around there. But that's how I like to teach that one, is in that sense. And that can lead you to, this was the example I was thinking of last night, pause and pause. Now, the reason that I was using, I don't know why this came to mind, because I think I was just watching TV and I thought about this. These both have the same, exactly the same, what is called an onset, right? So they both, the first sound is the same. And in fact, the whole word is exactly the same. So this is starting to get a little bit tricky. And now we're moving into comparison. So we're moving into, this is probably a really difficult example. We're starting to move in comparison where students are looking at comparing different words in various different ways. Now, you can see why that can be confusing for kids if they don't have a basic understanding over here. If they don't understand that and they don't understand that, then there's no way that you're going to be able to start talking about this type of stuff. So this is where it becomes very obvious. If students start really struggling here, then what you need to do is diagnose, go back over to here, test from there, starting from the top, moving down, and then that will give you the ability to treat it. You can fill in those gaps, because this is how I think of phonics, right? Or any subject really. That's all the stuff you need to know. Let's pretend that's the base of a building, the foundation of a building. So from here, what happens is, let's say that you've developed a course of some description, or students are going through and learning something, say phonics or whatever else it is. This bit here they know, 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 but there's two aspects of it that they don't know. So these are areas where there are significant or decent gaps in their ability that on their own you may not really notice. And let's just say that we even filled this one as well. And even half of that one, I guess we could fill in. Now I assume that's because we're talking about phonics being the foundational skills and foundational concepts and skills that we need to know before we can go on and do other stuff down here and certainly further over down there. So if they don't know that, then when we start building on those foundations, the base foundation isn't very strong. And you can always imagine it like building a house or something, right? So being able to find those little gaps and identify them is really important. And that's where you go about doing that in those reviews, in that diagnostic tests, and in that formative assessment that I've got another video about. So watch that formative assessment. But and also bearing in mind, I'm sort of a bit of a broken record here, but I always say that students are expert students, and for a lot of sections, they're able to fake that they do know something when they don't, because students don't want to be called out, I guess, in front of their friends that they don't know something. They don't want the teacher to know that they're lacking certain knowledge. So they become really good at pretending, and they develop a whole bunch of different strategies to be able to, I guess, bridge that gap there. Even though when you go through and do some diagnostic tests or some reviews and you're looking at even the super basic stuff, and particularly this applies to maths. If you start teaching Year 9 maths or working with a Year 9 maths group or an individual student, it's very important to go back to the bare bones basics. And that doesn't mean that you're going back full blown to number sense, but it may mean that you're looking at the basic multiplication and how to work simple things out like addition and so forth. So anyway, just bear that one in mind. Now, because we have gone over time a little bit, I wanted to talk very quickly about these other two, text creation and critical literacy. I apologise for writing that quite messily, but I just thought I would add that on to this model, because as I go through this and I think about the progress that students make through the life cycle of their education, they start off with knowing practically nothing. So they're effectively babies, well, they are babies, and they're just being exposed. So they've got zero knowledge there. Here they're starting to learn phonics at that second level. So let's say they're just learning basic letters and things. So I'm going to write that they know 10, around that they might know 10 sounds, say. Of course, there's a bit of a spectrum even within that band, right? But let's say there's 10. By the time you come down here, they're starting to learn words, and they might know a couple of hundred words or whatever, and that's only going to improve as time goes on. By the time they get here, it'll be several hundred, 300 to 500 type of thing, something in that range, I would assume. Anyway, now what it really is missing is what happens once you start getting past this point. And so I just wanted to add something there so you could see the full cycle, right? And of course, as I was saying before, at any point in there, if you're at comparison or whatnot and you feel like something's missing, go back to the start. And that applies to everything that you're teaching, whether you're teaching adults, whether you're teaching top-level PhD type students, professionals, or you're teaching students who are really struggling. It's all the same. All these teaching concepts apply to every single age group, ability, demographic, culture, location, whatever. They always just imagine that house and that there are gaps that need to be filled before that next level can be achieved with any level of confidence that it's going to be stable. Okay, so anyway, once you've gone through these stages down the bottom there where you're starting to play around with words and think about the differences between words and all this kind of stuff, there is something of a next step. So if that takes, say, a couple of years of education, this takes about 10 years of education. And you're talking here about text creation, so what takes up the majority of primary school and to an extent high school as well. And text creation is really about... So from here, they're not actually creating anything. They're just moving words around, playing with words, comparing them, so forth. Here, they're developing their own sentences from scratch, from ideas. They're taking information out of their head and articulating it in certain ways. They're not just thinking about the differences between words, they're using them for certain effects. So they're actually developing different types of text. Now, obviously they're doing that to an extent here, but they're really doing it here. So they're developing a short story or writing a little poem or something like that. And critical literacy is that next stage above that, where not only are they creating basic text or even more advanced text, but there's kind of another stage after that. This is more the high school level where you've got your I guess, proper English teachers spend most of their time teaching critical literacy, amongst other things, right? But critical literacy is a big thing in that English teacher space. But that's not to say that you can't teach it. It's just to say that that's an area that they concentrate on quite a lot. And it basically means that the person who is working with that text or interacting with that text or using that text for whatever reason, and a text, by the way, simply means something that has information on it. So usually writing, but a cave painting has information on it, an advert has information on it, a story, an article in a newspaper, a documentary, etc., etc. So any type of text, not only being able to create it in a sense or being able to create some aspect of it or some portion of it to a degree, but being able to interpret it and understand it and having that literacy. And what they mean by critical literacy is the ability to deconstruct it and look at it from different viewpoints and from different angles. So you're thinking about, why did an author do that? Why did they use that title? Why did they use that particular word? Could have they chosen other words? Why did they use that camera angle? Why did they use an angle from here to look at the subject down there? Why did they have this particular person and not a different type of person? What effect would have that had? Why did they describe it in this way? Why did they structure it in this way? Why did they use this genre to explain this thing? What type of themes are there? And so on and so forth. So, for example, in a basic year 9 or 10 English class, you might start looking at adverts in a newspaper or an adverts for a particular takeaway store compared to adverts for another takeaway store, and try and figure out what their target market is and why they use language in that way, and they're using certain words to describe things and so on and so forth, and pictures. So that's all about literacy. Literacy is the ability to use information in a way that's practical and real world. So it helps you interact with the real world and interpret the real world in more and more active and precise and articulate ways, and in ways in which you intend and want to. And critical literacy is also about protecting people, so they learn to prevent being scammed and so on and so forth. So anyway, that is just to show that there is a bit of it's not even a cycle, I guess it's a long process from zero all the way through to deconstruction of other people's texts, and that's just my little take on it. So that's pretty much everything I've got to say about phonics and phonemic awareness and phonological awareness. I hope that makes sense and that you at least get something out of it. You're not expected to remember all of this every single time you go to use flashcards, because that's a bit silly, but if you can take a few things out of this, then that would be, I think I've hit my goal as far as what I wanted to achieve here. I have covered a lot, but again, you don't feel that you need to memorize it all and whatnot. The one thing I do like to talk about is this idea of diagnosis and diagnostic testing, because I have harped on this a little bit, but I just want to drill it home, because when I talk to people about this, I feel like this is a bit of a blind spot where a lot of teachers in particular, teacher aides, they're asking about what program should I use and so on and so forth. There's always new programs coming out, and I think in a way a lot of them are cons, and really you can do all of this yourself. Flashcards are good because they're tactile, they're interesting and colourful and aesthetically pleasing and things like that, but and it's just easier to buy them than to make them yourself, so it's definitely a time saver. But by and large, for pretty much everything you do in the education world, and particularly when it comes to the basic type stuff, whether you're creating activities or whatever, if you're very specific about what your goals are for that activity, it's very easy to then develop a couple of activities to be able to meet. If you're very specific about what your goals are, what the learning goals are for that student, then it's quite easy to create those activities, because, as I always say, there's no magic pill here. There's no special neuroscience or fantastic program that's going to mean that your students or your children or whatever are going to be 10 times better. By and large, it comes down to exposure. Huge amounts of exposure, lots of repetition, lots of fun, lots of different exposure from lots of different people and text types and so on and so forth. And when it does come to that diagnosis side of it, again, if you're very specific about what the problem is or what you're trying to achieve with that activity, because a diagnostic test is effectively an activity. So while you're going through that activity, you're thinking about, I think they're at this exposure phonics level, but I think that they've probably got problems with something. So you're doing the test for some reason. Maybe you're doing the test to see where they fit there. Maybe you're doing the test to see where they fit there. Maybe you do one test there and then one there. And that can be as simple as just going through with flashcards and just having a look. It doesn't have to be some crazy test that has all these statistics and graphs and tables and all this kind of mumbo jumbo. I've seen those and I just don't think that they're that useful personally. That's my personal opinion. I think you can easily diagnose things yourself, and then you can easily come up with a treatment for that particular diagnosis. So just bear that in mind. Keep it simple, stick to the basics, and remember to make it fun and interactive, heaps of exposure, heaps of repetition at the right level, and I don't think you can really go that wrong. That's my take on phonics, and I hope it was useful.